Hi, I'm Effie, and today I'm going to be talking about the top 10 best books that I have read so far in 2023. These books are going to be in no particular order, they're just the 10 books that have stood out to me as being exceptional so far this year. The first book that makes this list is Lost in the Moment and Found by Seanan and McGuire. This is book 8 in the Wayward Children series, which is a portal fantasy series where children find doors to worlds they are better suited for. The way that it's worked so far is every odd number takes place in our world, and every even number transports us to one of these portal worlds that the children end up in. So as this was book 8, we ended up visiting one of the worlds. I can't remember the exact name of the world, but I think it's like the shop of lost and found things. And it's a bit like a nexus to other portal worlds. So you get a little bit of a vision of the other worlds. You also get, I think you get a nod to the Moors, which I'm a little sick of the Moors continually popping up, but it makes sense. It's been in a lot of the books so far. But what really stood out to me, apart from the fact that every time there's a new Wayward Children novel, it becomes my favourite, was that I really connected with the child in this book. The circumstances are quite different, like her trauma is different from my trauma, but I could connect with her feeling of her childhood being stolen from her. And I just thought it was an absolutely beautifully written book, even down to the author's note at the start, which serves as a content warning and a reassurance. The next book on my list is Dear Ash by Simone. This is just a very short book that takes place just before the end of American King, and it was just so sweet. It's this correspondence from one of the characters of the New Camelot series to another one of the New Camelot series, and it gives an insight into a scene that you don't see depicted on the page. Like, you hear about it, but you don't see it depicted in as much detail as this letter gives us, and I thought it was really sweet and added just that little bit extra dimension to the New Camelot series. The next book on my list is Blow Part 1 by November Sweets. In this book, we are following a character who has had a very traumatic childhood, and as an adult, the way that she's coping with it is by using sex, drugs, alcohol, going to the club pretty much every night. And she ends up catching the eye of the club's 4 owners. So it's largely a romance. There is a bit of a threat in the background, but the majority of this book is focused on our main character and the romance that she has with these 4 club owners. It was really beautifully written. I loved the way that she wasn't ever framed as being broken. The men weren't trying to change her. They were saying they loved her just the way she was. If she wanted to change something like, say, her drug addiction, they would fully support her. But they were going to be there for her and love her no matter what. And it was just so incredibly sweet and so affirming. The less said about the sequel, the better, though. The 4th book on my list is On the Savage Side by Tiffany and McDaniel. This is a fictionalization of a very real true crime. the Chillicothe Six, where 6 women were missing or murdered in Chillicothe in the United States, and because of who they were, their cases were somewhat disregarded by the police. And whilst there is suspicion around the culprit, these cases remain unsolved. The way that Tiffany McDaniel has written this book, we are following Ark and Daffy, a pair of twins, all the way from their childhood, which unfortunately is not the happiest childhood, right the way up into their adulthood. We follow their successes, we follow their failures, we see the impact that generational trauma has had on them, as well as things like poverty, sex work, drug addiction, and just a whole raft of things. There were 2 very significant surprises for me in this book, and it's quite interesting because I buddy read this book with 3 people on Spoops' Discord, and there was a 50-50 split between people that saw certain things coming and people that didn't. And it was also just a very enjoyable experience to see people's thoughts develop as they read the book. I thought that the way that McDaniel handled this story, given that it is based on a true crime, whilst all the women in this book have been fictionalized and their backstories have been made up by McDaniel, there is some borrowing of the real women's backstories, but it's not trying to be the story of the women that were or are the Chillicothe Six. But what it's doing is telling their story in a way that remains respectful, but also, and people who are murdered or go missing shouldn't need to be humanized, but unfortunately the way that this case was so overlooked by the police, somewhat, it does feel like they need to be humanized. This was probably one of the most heartbreaking books I'd ever read. There were moments where I screamed out loud, sobbed uncontrollably, but at the same time, it was also one of the most beautiful books that I've ever read. In a slight tonal shift, we have Sanctuary Cities by Charlotte Amelia Poe. In this book, our main character Milo wakes up in an airport with no recollection of how he got there or basically any memories, and his parents basically just section him straight away. And whilst in the hospital where he's been sectioned, he meets a boy called Stuart. I believe he's his roommate, and together they start kind of piecing Milo's life back together. I thought this was a really well crafted story. The fact that Milo has amnesia means that the reader is learning things at exactly the same time that Milo's learning them. But beyond that, I thought the love story between Milo and Stuart was very sweet. There were lots of lovely moments. Also, they're obsessed with a superhero series, which I need that series to be real because it sounds utterly fantastic. Yeah, love this book. The next book on my list is Rule of Wolves by Leigh Bardugo. It's somewhat difficult to talk about this book because it's part of the Grishaverse, but unless there's been like novellas and stuff, this is the latest published Grishaverse story, and the events that happen in the book are so far away from where Shadow and Bone starts the story But needless to say, I loved a lot of the things that happened with the characters. There was one moment in Crooked Kingdom that made me so mad. And I think anyone that's read Crooked Kingdom would immediately know what that moment was. But I thought that King of Scars and definitely Rule of Wolves more than made up for the moment in Crooked Kingdom that I disliked, because the events that happened couldn't have happened if that other thing hadn't happened. Sorry. I know I'm being really vague, but I don't want to spoil this book, which is another thing. I had been spoiled for that thing in Crooked Kingdom. But I think part of what worked for this story, apart from the fact that, you know, there was some moments that were so satisfying for the individual characters, was the way that there seemed to be a really clear trail of cause and effect, a butterfly effect, in that if one specific event hadn't happened exactly the way it did, then we never could have got to the place that we ended up at the end of the story. I think that the place this book leaves the Grishaverse is very satisfying, but it also creates a very interesting dynamic for what could come next in the Grishaverse. But yeah, it was very satisfying, especially after being disappointed by the Six of Crows duology. Next up, we've got Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. This is always described as lesbian necromancers in space. What I didn't realise is that it is somewhat of a trial. There's puzzles, there's a murder mystery, there's a lot going on, and it's just so compelling. I mean, I'm a sucker for a trial, so that alone. Sorry. Someone just walked past my window and it gave me a fright. There's a lot going on in the book, but it never feels like there's too much going on. I was also really pleasantly surprised by the fact that this book actually didn't pickle my brain, because everyone says it's confusing, you don't know what's going on, but kind of just go with it. But I actually found it relatively easy, comfortable to follow along with, and I overall had a good time. Also, there's a bit at the end that's really shocking to me. Can you tell I like shocking bits in my books? And I am so interested to see where Harrow the Ninth takes the story, considering what happens in Gideon. The Kindred by Alechia Dow is a YA sci-fi. I think it's YA. In the world that Dow's created, at the point that babies are born, they are given a mental link with one other person in the universe, galaxy, and they are known as their kindred, and they basically spend their whole life feeling what their kindred feels, being able to communicate psychically with their kindred, and just having this really sweet, wholesome connection. So in this story, we are following a prince who is quite a distant heir to the imperial throne. And we are following a young girl who lives on a planet that's been overlooked, colonized, is very badly treated. These two were never meant to be kindred. There was meant to be a rule where royalty didn't have such low-born kindred, but this happened, and they have the sweetest, most wholesome connection, and then everything hits the fan and they have to go on the run and they end up on Earth. and it's a little bit of a fun fish out of water story, but there's also some really sweet, wholesome moments. It just did not miss at all. I think every beat of this story was absolutely perfect, well timed, sweet, was saying something, and it just brought me so much joy. And I definitely think I need to go back and read, I think Dow's only got one other book, but I definitely want to go back and read that, given how much I enjoyed The Kindred. Our penultimate book is Our Dark Duet by Schwab. This is the second book in the Monsters of Verity duology. In this series, we are seeing a city that has been divided between the way that one side of the city has responded to monsters being created out of the chaos, and how the other side has responded. So, on one side, they have decided to dominate the monsters and make them their pets, their weapons. And on the other side, they just murk them. So, with this being the sequel, a lot has happened in the first book. But it took a really interesting turn where one of the core principles of this series, but also a lot of Schwab's work, is the idea of grey morality and what it means to be human. And this took it so much further, where we're seeing the characters truly struggling with the differentiation between monster and human. We also saw the introduction of some very fun new characters. There was some really heartbreaking moments as well. I think I've said this in a previous video, but this could quite possibly be my favourite Schwab that I've ever read. It's a little bit like trying to pick a favourite child, because Schwab's work pretty much never misses. And the way that this explored grey morality was done so perfectly, and you really connected with a lot of these characters and were just rooting for them and hoping that they'd somehow come out the other side. And the final book that I want to talk about today is Fake Famous by Dana L. Davis. This is a sort of Prince and the Pauper story where a young woman who lives and works on her family's farm makes a joking TikTok where she pretends that she's this pop star who she bears a passing resemblance to, and that TikTok ends up going viral, largely because through a series of crazy events, the pop star happens to have matching hair and a bump on her head in the same place as our girl from a farm. So the pop star decides to enlist the girl from the farm to pretend to be her for a week, so the pop star can get away, relax, and just try and work on bettering herself. There is a fun element of this girl like trying to feel like she's worthy, and also being completely a fish out of water, thrown into this pop star's world, not really knowing what's happening. Also, there's a really cute romance going on, and through this romance it ends up as a fake dating situation. Wait, it's already a fake dating situation, but it becomes a fake dating situation, which sounds more complicated than it was. Dana L. Davis is another one of those authors whose writing just tends to hit. So far I've read The Voice in My Head, Somebody I Used to Know, and now Fake Famous, and all of them just hit just right and are just perfection. So those were the 10 best books that I've read so far in 2023. I'd love to know your thoughts on if you'd read any of these, if any of these books sound like something you would like to pick up. And until next time, love you. Bye.